Hi everyone, it's John. It's Tuesday, so I have another book review for you, naturally. This week is a book about a a guy whose name you might recognize, but who doesn't get maybe doesn't have household level sort of recognition. He's a famous diplomat, American diplomat of the 20th century. His name is George F. Kennan. And this is a biography of him, basically, by John Lewis Gaddis, the famous American historian at Yale. And this is George F. Kennan, An American Life. This came out in 2011, and I bought it not long after it came out, and it is sat on my shelf for close to 8 years, I guess, completely untouched and unmolested. But after having spent a couple of weeks trudging through it, more details on that in a second. Here I am to tell you about it. It is quite a hefty little thing. So, never having actually held a title above that of ambassador, which he was to both the Soviet Union and later to Yugoslavia, George F. Kennan's work has received really a vast amount of critical attention in foreign policy magazines, by political analysts, geopolitical people, but not many really serious, fully fleshed out biographies. Today he's best remembered as one of the so-called wise men in the years leading up to and during and slightly after World War II. He was actually commonly thought of as one of the wisest of the wise men. Averell Harriman was another, if that name rings a bell. And he's especially thought of, perhaps most famously, as being the person most responsible for the United States' approach to Soviet communism that today we refer to as containment. In other words, a way to sort of contain, sort of cordon off Soviet influence from its neighbors. Obviously, we didn't succeed too much in China since Mao took power there, and we didn't succeed very much in Eastern Europe. But beyond that, the policy of containment worked quite well, and of course, in the late 80s and early 90s, communism sort of saw its last bits of influence in those countries. Not in China, but in the other ones. If you're already familiar with the larger body of John Lewis Gaddis's work, which mostly centers around the Cold War and contemporary diplomatic history, by which I mean 20th century, you'll see that a lot of what is included in this book, An American Life, is simply reconfigured for the purposes of writing a biography. Which is not to say, of course, or to suggest that this life will not go down as Kennan's definitive biography, which I'm pretty sure it will. As any biographer must do, Gaddis walks you through Kennan's 101 years, lived to be 101 years old, providing detailed, sometimes painfully hyper-detailed vignettes from his life, beginning with his growing up the son in a motherless household, to his graduation from Princeton University, to his first trip abroad to Moscow during the late 1920s, when he first started working for the Foreign Service. Through the entire arc of Kennan's life, Gaddis has a particularly keen ability at letting Kennan's own sense of personal, subjective alienation shine through. Even as he worked his way up through the head of the policy planning staff, which was sort of an apparatus of the State Department in its early days in the 30s and 40s, the ambassadorship of two different countries, the composition of the the groundbreaking telegram that he has written, the famously the longest telegram up to that point that the State Department has ever been responsible for composing, the famous long telegram. It's so long they even named it for how long it was. And then the Mr. X article published in the magazine Foreign Affairs. Even though he did all of those things in a relatively short period of time, Kennan never quite felt that he grew to be anything more of an insider. He always had this distance about him that he felt. He always felt that he was a bit of an iconoclast inhabiting a space of liminality. This biography is also thoroughly interlarded with Kennan's personal letters and diary entries. He was an inveterate diarist, all of which were given over to him by Kennan's wife, Annalise, upon his death in 2005. Between the letters and the occasional Kennan poem he includes in the text, poetry being yet another literary form for which Kennan was neither ill-inclined nor ill-suited, his uniquely sparkling writing style really shines through. After formally retiring from diplomatic life in the early 1960s, after a pretty brief stint as the ambassador to Yugoslavia, Kennan took up residence at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, where he graduated, and would remain for the next half-century, writing 17 books and hundreds of articles on geopolitics and history and quite a few other things, too. Russia Leaves the War, which came out in 1956, garnered him a Pulitzer Prize, a National Book Award for Nonfiction, the Francis Parkman Prize, and the Bancroft Prize. The Parkman and the Bancroft being two of the country's, maybe even the world's, most illustrious awards for historiography. And Memoirs 1925 to 1950 won him a second Pulitzer Prize and a second National Book Award. Both lasting testaments, I think, to his abilities, not only as a scholar and a historian, but also as a highly gifted prose stylist. If he wouldn't have been a diplomat and been a historian, I think he would have had maybe a career as a novelist or a poet somewhere in his path. The sheer size of the book, right at 800 pages, 700 pages of text, and then exactly another 100 pages of endnotes, bibliography, and appendices, is going to be a little bit intimidating for those who might recognize Kennan's name, but only be able to connect it maybe with the idea of his criticism of the Vietnam War or containment of communism or something like that, but know little else about him. Quite frankly, that's the position I was in when I first picked it up 8 years ago. Learned only marginally more in the next 8 years until I had read the book. With Gaddis's interest, especially in diplomacy, though, there aren't many stones he leaves unturned in his writing about Kennan's life, even those that could be construed as overly obscure or abstruse for someone who just wanted to learn more about Kennan, like his influence in East Asian policy or his philosophy of realism and the ways in which these were situated in the context of 20th century American history. Because of the details, I found the middle third of the book to be especially difficult to trudge through, as some of the information was not exactly successful in holding my attention. Gaddis is, however, brutally honest when it comes to some of Kennan's less mainstream views. He makes really no attempt to normalize or make more palatable the opinions of his otherwise pretty curmudgeonly colleague. Kennan's thinking, especially as expressed in his private correspondence, shares a unique contempt for democracy. Quote, this is from a letter to his sister dated 1935, so he would have been 31. Not extremely young, but not perhaps old yet. Certainly not a child. He says, I hate democracy, I hate the press, I hate the people, and he spells it in a very sort of faux demotic P-E-P-U-L, as in to mock the way the common people talk. I have become clearly un-American, he says. And nor did age or experience dilute his anti-majoritarianism. It only festers in his old age, slowly turning into a distinct distaste for, quote, motorbikes, girlfriends, drugs, pornography, drunkenness, noise, by which I'm sure he means rock and roll, and other things. His various memoirs, including, and he did publish several volumes of them, including the last he published, which was titled Upon a Cragged Hill, the line taken from one of John Donne's poems, includes a condemnation of government-imposed racial integration in Southern schools and Southern society generally. Gaddis was a close friend of Kennan in his later years, a fact which he never really tries to hide in the course of the book, and occasionally, but never obtrusively, inserts into the text when it's appropriate. This book was begun in 1982, 37 years ago this year, when Kennan was already in old age, but still had over 2 decades of life left in him. So this was, like you said, he started the book, he set it aside, clearly a project of love. In 1982, he floated the idea of a biography to Kennan, never really got around to finishing it, perhaps feeling maybe a bit awkward about writing the biography of a man who seemed, despite all of his intellectual proclivities and his aloofness, to be hanging on to life with rather great tenacity. Kennan's 2005 death finally gave Gaddis all the tools that he needed to write the biography honestly that he proposed to do all those years before. And I think Kennan would have been pleased to see how grand of a picture it paints without ever really turning into maudlin hagiography. If you have any interest in American diplomacy, especially as regarding the early years of the Cold War, and how the Cold War was actually engaged in on a diplomatic level, this book, if you have answers about, or if you have questions about that, this book will probably clear them up. It covers quite a bit of ground, and it is a pretty fascinating life. This is John Lewis Gaddis's George F. Kennan, An American Life. I will see you next week, guys.